Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going way back to the very beginnings of American history. We're talking at least 15,000 years ago, back to those first migrations over the Bering Strait from Siberia. And what's amazing to me, even then, all those millennia ago, there was already this huge amount of diversity among the people who lived here. Different languages, different ways of life, different beliefs, different social structures. It's really pretty remarkable.
I know, right? It really makes you realize how much we tend to oversimplify things when we talk about Native Americans.
Yeah.
As if it's one monolithic group. For thousands and thousands of years, they were developing their own unique cultures and societies, completely separate from what was going on in Europe, Asia, Africa. It's mind-boggling to think about. By the time the Europeans showed up around 1500, estimates suggest there were something like 7 to 10 million people living north of Mexico. That's a lot of people, organized in communities with their own ways of doing things. And of course, further south, you had the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas with their incredible civilizations.
Yeah. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to track the really big social, political, and economic forces that shaped America from those ancient origins all the way up to the 21st century. It's a huge undertaking, but we're going to use this concise historical overview as our roadmap, so to speak, to highlight the really key developments along the way.
Right. And it's important to remember that because we're working with this concise overview, we're going to have to skip over a lot of the finer details. We're not trying to be exhaustive here. Our goal is to pick out the really major threads, the turning points that were driven by those big social, political, and economic forces and the lasting effects they've had on the America we know today.
Okay, so before we get into European contact and all of that, let's talk about those established native societies for a minute. It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking of the Americas as this empty, pristine wilderness before the Europeans arrived. But as you've already pointed out, that's completely wrong. What did these societies actually look like in terms of their social, political, and economic structures?
Yeah, virgin land myth is a really powerful one, and it really served the interests of the colonizers. But the reality is, the Americas were anything but empty. You had all sorts of social, political, and economic structures in place. Politically, you had everything from small, independent bands to large, complex confederations with sophisticated systems of governance and decision-making. There wasn't one single model. It really depended on the specific cultural group and their environment.
So it's not like they were all living in tipis and hunting buffalo.
Right, exactly. The diversity is really key here. Socially, Native American groups had these intricate kinship networks and elaborate religious beliefs that were very much connected to the natural world. And their economic systems were complex too. Agriculture was widespread, with advanced techniques, and long-distance trade was very common. They were definitely not primitive or backwards in any way.
So then you have the arrival of the Europeans. What were the really big social, political, and economic factors over in Europe that pushed them to sail across the Atlantic in the late 15th century?
Well, Europe was going through a period of really intense change in the late 15th century. You had social upheaval, political consolidation, and this huge economic drive to find new trade routes to the east, especially to get spices. The Ottomans controlled the land routes, and that made things expensive, so the Europeans were desperate to find a sea route. Plus, you had all these advancements in shipbuilding and navigation, which themselves were the product of all this social and intellectual ferment happening in Europe. It was a perfect storm, really. And of course, you can't forget the political ambitions of the European monarchs. They were competing with each other for power and prestige, and expanding their empires was a big part of that.
And that brings us to Columbus. Sailing under the Spanish flag in 1492, convinced he'd found a shortcut to the Indies. It's amazing how long he clung to that belief. What were the immediate social, political, and economic consequences of his arrival, both for Europe and for the Americas?
Well, Columbus's voyages were a monumental turning point in history. For Europe, it opened up this whole new world of possibilities. You suddenly had access to these vast new territories and resources. The problem is that this also triggered this fierce competition among the European powers to grab as much land and wealth as they could. And that had a huge impact on European politics and the balance of power. Economically, it led to this massive exchange of goods, plants, and animals across the Atlantic, which really transformed global trade. But for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it was a catastrophe.
Yeah, disease wiped out huge percentages of the native population.
Exactly. Their societies were decimated by diseases they had no immunity to, their cultures were disrupted, their religions were often suppressed, and their land, well, that was just taken. It was a brutal collision of worlds, and the consequences were tragic.
And then you have the rapid spread of European settlements across the Americas. The Spanish were in Florida and New Mexico, the Dutch were in what's now New York. What were the main social, political, and economic features of these different colonial projects?
Each European power had its own distinct approach to colonization. The Spanish, for example, were really focused on extracting wealth. They wanted gold, silver, all that. Plus, they were very intent on converting the native population to Catholicism. Their colonies were run in a very hierarchical way, with the Spanish crown firmly in control. The Dutch, on the other hand, were much more commercially minded. Their main interest was trade, especially the fur trade. Their colonies were a bit more decentralized, and they were actually more tolerant of different religions, which attracted a wider range of settlers. And then you have the English, who were also driven by a mix of economic and religious motivations.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how the Protestant Reformation back in Europe had a big impact on the character of the English colonies, except for Maryland. How did these religious differences affect how the English settlements developed?
Well, the Reformation really shook things up in England. You had all these different Protestant groups breaking away from the Catholic Church, each with their own ideas about how society should be organized. And when these groups came to the Americas, they brought those ideas with them. Take the Pilgrims and the Puritans, for example. They were fleeing religious persecution in England, and they were determined to create societies based on their own strict beliefs. That's how you ended up with those tight-knit, religiously homogenous communities in New England, with their emphasis on moral purity and social conformity. Their entire social structure was shaped by their religious doctrines.
So austere worship, predestination, all of that. And then you've got the middle colonies, like Pennsylvania, which were founded on very different principles, like the Quakers' holy experiment with its emphasis on religious tolerance. Socially, it seems like those colonies were much more diverse and open right from the beginning. What were the big social and political ideas behind those differences?
It really comes down to the fundamental beliefs of the people who founded these colonies. The Puritans in New England believed in a strict social order ordained by God. They saw themselves as a chosen people, a city on a hill, as John Winthrop famously put it, meant to be an example for the rest of the world. That's why they were so focused on enforcing religious and moral conformity within their communities. They saw it as a way to maintain social order and ensure their survival in this new, unfamiliar land. But William Penn, the Quaker who founded Pennsylvania, had a very different vision. He believed in the inherent equality of all people and the importance of religious freedom. So he created a colony that was intentionally welcoming to people of all faith, which led to a much more diverse and pluralistic society. That tolerance was a deliberate political and social choice, and it had a huge impact on the development of Pennsylvania and the other middle colonies.
We've talked about how the different European powers had very different approaches to colonization, but of course they all had one thing in common. They were encountering and displacing the native populations who were already here. What were the main social, political, and economic forces that shaped those encounters? And what were the long-term consequences?
Well, the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans was really a clash of completely different ways of life. You had different social structures, different political systems, different economic systems, different understandings of land ownership, different religions, different conceptions of time and history. It was inevitable that there would be misunderstandings and conflict, and the consequences for Native Americans were devastating.
Millions died from European diseases.
Exactly. They had no immunity to these new diseases.
Yes.
Smallpox, measles, influenza. They wiped out whole communities. And then you had the violence, the displacement, the forced assimilation. Their traditional ways of life were disrupted, their economies were undermined, and their political structures were destroyed. It was a tragedy of epic proportions.
And in the midst of all this, you have the introduction of slavery into the colonies. What were the main factors that led to the development of this horrific institution?
Slavery is a complex issue with deep historical roots. But in the American context, I think it's important to understand that it was primarily driven by economic factors. The demand for cheap labor, especially in the southern colonies, is what fueled the growth of the slave trade. As the plantation economy grew, so did the demand for enslaved Africans. Of course, there were also social and political factors involved. The idea of white supremacy was used to justify the enslavement of Africans, and laws were passed to create a system where enslaved people had absolutely no rights. It was a brutal and dehumanizing system, built on greed and racism.
It's hard to believe that something so horrific could exist alongside these lofty ideals of liberty and equality that were supposedly at the heart of the American experiment.
Right, the hypocrisy is glaring. And this tension between slavery and freedom would eventually tear the nation apart. But it's important to remember, that even in these early years, there were people who recognized the evil of slavery and spoke out against it. Abolitionist movements were already starting to emerge, and that struggle for racial justice would continue for centuries.
So as these colonies were developing, you pointed out that there was a lot of diversity among the European settlers themselves, and that this core Protestant belief in individual responsibility really shaped the social and political landscape. Can you talk more about how those factors played out?
Well, think about it. You had all these different groups coming to America: English, French, Dutch, German, Scotch-Irish, and more, each with their own traditions, languages, and religions. Plus, you had different social classes represented. This mix of people meant that it was never going to be a simple, homogeneous society. They were bound to be different perspectives and conflicts.
Right. It wasn't like everyone was singing Yankee Doodle and getting along.
Yeah, exactly. And then you had this strong Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and the idea that everyone had a direct relationship with God. This really challenged the traditional hierarchies of power that existed in Europe. It led to this questioning of authority, both religious and political, which helped lay the groundwork for the later revolutions in both America and France.
You also mentioned the Puritan idea of a city on a hill. It seems like that concept has really stuck with Americans, even as it's been reinterpreted over time.
Oh, absolutely. That idea that America has this special destiny, that it's a beacon of hope and freedom for the rest of the world, it's incredibly powerful and enduring. It's been used to justify everything from westward expansion to military intervention overseas as part of the American mythos. The problem is, it often blinds us to our own flaws and hypocrisies.
Now, we've talked about the diversity of the European settlers, but what about women? What were their roles in colonial society?
Well, life for women in the colonies was tough. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere, they had very few legal rights, and they were expected to be subservient to their husbands. But that's not the whole story. In practice, women often had to take on roles that went beyond traditional expectations, especially on the frontier, where survival depended on everyone pitching in. Women were running farms, managing businesses, even taking up arms in some cases.
So it sounds like necessity sometimes trumped tradition.
Right. And even within the confines of their domestic roles, women wielded considerable influence. They were responsible for educating their children, managing the household economy, and maintaining social networks. They weren't powerless by any means. And throughout the colonial period, you see women starting to challenge those traditional gender roles. They were writing, speaking out, organizing, laying the groundwork for the women's rights movements that would come later.
Okay, so in these early years, we see growing conflicts between the English and French settlers, often with Native American groups on both sides. This eventually culminates in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. What were the big forces behind this conflict, and what were its lasting consequences?
Well, there were a lot of factors at play. You had the obvious competition for land and resources. Both the English and French wanted control of the fur trade and expand their colonial holdings. But there were also religious and cultural differences. The English were mostly Protestant, while the French were Catholic, and both sides saw Native American alliances as crucial to their success. The war was brutal, with fighting all across the continent. And when the dust settled, England had emerged victorious. France lost all of its territory in North America east of the Mississippi. This was a huge victory for England, but it also planted the seeds for future conflict with the American colonies.
Right. The war had been expensive, and England was looking for ways to recoup its losses. They started imposing new taxes on the colonists who were used to a certain degree of self-governance, and that's what really set the stage for the revolution.
Exactly. You can see how all these threads we've been talking about, social, political, economic, they all came together to create this perfect storm that led to the American Revolution.
So that brings us to the period of revolution, the drafting of the Constitution, and the birth of a new nation between 1763 and 1789. It's a period of huge change, both politically and socially. What were the key social, political, and economic forces that drove this revolutionary era?
The American Revolution wasn't just about taxes. It was about this fundamental clash of ideas about liberty, representation, and who had the right to govern. Socially, you had this growing sense of American identity and a belief in the right to self-determination. People were starting to see themselves as Americans, not just British subjects. Politically, the colonists were furious about the way they were being treated by the British Parliament. They had no representation in Parliament, yet they were being taxed without their consent. It was a violation of their rights as Englishmen, as they saw it. And economically, British policies like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act were seen as attempts to strangle the colonial economy. So you had all these factors combining to create this powerful movement for independence.
Let's talk about those escalating tensions with Great Britain after 1763. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act. These might seem like relatively minor things in the grand scheme of things, but they really ignited a firestorm of protest. What were the core principles at stake for the colonists?
It wasn't just about the money, though that was certainly a factor. It was about the principle of the thing. The colonists believed that they should not be taxed without their consent, and they saw these acts as direct assault on their liberties as Englishmen. They were being denied their fundamental rights, and they were not going to stand for it. Remember, the colonists had a long tradition of self-governance. They had their own colonial assemblies that levied taxes and made laws. They were used to having a say in how they were governed. So when the British Parliament started imposing taxes without their consent, it was a huge violation of their understanding of how government should work.
And events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party really galvanized public opinion, didn't they?
Absolutely. The Boston Massacre, regardless of who was really at fault, became the symbol of British tyranny. That image of British soldiers firing on unarmed colonists, it spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, and it really inflamed passions. And then the Boston Tea Party, that was a deliberate act of defiance, dumping all that tea into the harbor. It was a way of saying, we're not playing by your rules anymore. It was a huge gamble, and it really escalated the conflict with Britain.
So how did the colonists move from protesting these specific British policies to making the case for full-blown independence? What were the key ideas that shaped that shift?
It was a gradual process, for sure. But a couple of things really stand out. First, the colonists were becoming more and more influenced by Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and self-governance. They were reading Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. They were debating these ideas in their newspapers and pamphlets, and they were starting to believe that they had the right to overthrow a tyrannical government. Then you have the impact of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. That pamphlet was incredibly influential. It laid out a clear and compelling argument for independence in plain language that everyone could understand. It was a bestseller. And finally, you can't underestimate the role of leadership. Figures like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they were able to articulate those ideals of liberty and self-government in a way that inspired people to action.
Okay, so we have the Declaration of Independence, and then the war breaks out. It was a long and difficult struggle, and it really transformed American society in many ways. How did the war affect social, political, and economic life in the colonies?
Well, I mean, war always has a huge impact on society. You had families torn apart, communities disrupted, economies strained. The Continental Army was chronically short of supplies, and financing the war effort was a constant struggle. But the war also had some surprising social consequences. Women, for example, had to take on new roles while the men were away fighting. They were running farms, businesses, and even participating in the war effort themselves. And of course, the war really brought the issue of slavery to the forefront. You had enslaved people fighting on both sides of the conflict, and it really forced Americans to confront the hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while millions remained enslaved.
So the war ends, the colonies are victorious, and now they have to figure out how to create a new government. What were the main problems with the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government that led to the push for a new constitution?
The Articles of Confederation were really a reaction to the tyranny of the British monarchy. The colonists were so afraid of centralized power that they created a government that was too weak to function effectively. The central government couldn't tax, it couldn't regulate commerce, it couldn't even enforce its own laws. It was basically a loose alliance of independent states, each jealously guarding its own sovereignty. And that led to a lot of problems. There was economic chaos, interstate disputes, and a general lack of national unity.
Yeah, it sounds like they overcorrected a bit after throwing off the yoke of British rule.
They definitely did. It became clear pretty quickly that the Articles weren't working. So they called for a convention to revise them. But what they ended up doing was scrapping the Articles altogether and writing a whole new constitution.
The Constitutional Convention was a pretty contentious affair, wasn't it? You had all these different factions with different interests and different visions for the new nation.
Oh, absolutely. It was a battle royale. You had the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists, who were more concerned about states' rights and individual liberty. And then, of course, there was the elephant in the room: slavery. How to deal with this institution that was so fundamentally at odds with the ideals of liberty and equality that the nation was supposedly founded on. It was a huge problem, and it led to some really messy compromises, like the 3/5 compromise, which counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. It was a political solution to a moral problem, and it would come back to haunt the nation later.
So the new nation is born under this new constitution, and it immediately faces all the challenges that come with trying to create a stable and prosperous society. You talk about the promise and perils of nationhood in this period between 1789 and 1850. What were some of those promises and perils?
Well, on the one hand, there was this incredible sense of optimism and possibility. The American experiment was underway, and there was a real belief that they could create a better world, a more just and equitable society. But there were also huge challenges. The nation was deeply divided over issues like slavery, the role of the federal government, and the direction of economic development. Political parties emerged, with the Federalists and Democratic Republicans vying for power. And internationally, the young nation was trying to find its place in a world dominated by European powers. There were wars, economic crises, and constant threats to its security. It was a time of both great hope and great uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the story of America is never a simple one. It's full of contradictions, triumphs, and tragedies. And as we move through the 19th century, we see those contradictions becoming even more pronounced, especially when it comes to the issue of slavery.
Absolutely. Slavery is really the original sin of America. And as the nation expanded westward, the question of whether slavery should be allowed in new territories became increasingly divisive. You had compromises like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 trying to paper over those divisions, but it was clear that something had to give. The tension was just building and building.
And that tension eventually explodes in the Civil War, one of the most devastating conflicts in American history. What were the key factors that led to this war, and how did it reshape the social, political, and economic landscape of the nation?
The Civil War was the culmination of decades of simmering conflict over slavery, states' rights, and the very nature of the Union. You had this fundamental moral divide over the institution of slavery, but there were also economic and political factors at play. The South's economy was heavily reliant on slave labor, and they saw any attempt to restrict slavery as a threat to their way of life. The war itself was incredibly brutal, with over 600,000 Americans killed, but it also had a transformative effect on American society. It led to the abolition of slavery, the expansion of federal power, and the beginning of a long and difficult process of reconciliation and reconstruction.
And of course, the war had a huge impact on African Americans. What did freedom actually look like for formerly enslaved people in the years after the war?
Well, emancipation was a momentous event, but it didn't magically solve all the problems. The end of slavery didn't automatically translate into social or economic equality. African Americans still face discrimination, violence, and poverty.
Yeah, the promises of Reconstruction went largely unfulfilled, didn't they?
Right. The federal government tried to rebuild the South and protect the rights of freedmen, but there was a lot of resistance, especially from white Southerners who were determined to maintain white supremacy. And by the 1870s, Reconstruction had essentially been abandoned, leaving African Americans to face a new era of segregation and oppression under Jim Crow. It was a tragic betrayal of the hopes and promises of emancipation.
Despite the failures of Reconstruction, this period also saw the incredible rise of industrial America. How did these economic changes transform American society?
Well, it was a time of massive change. You had the development of railroads, the growth of factories, the rise of big business, and this huge influx of immigrants coming to work in those factories. It was a period of tremendous economic growth, but also led to huge social problems: poverty, inequality, child labor, environmental degradation. It was a classic case of progress and its discontents.
And you start to see a pushback against those problems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the rise of the progressive movement. What were the progressives trying to achieve?
The progressives were a diverse group of reformers who were responding to the social and economic ills of the Gilded Age. They wanted to rein in corporate power, protect consumers and workers, and make government more efficient and accountable. They were motivated by a real sense of moral outrage at the conditions they saw around them. And they believed that government had a role to play in addressing those problems. They weren't revolutionaries, but they were pushing for real change.
And they achieved some significant victories too, like women's suffrage, the regulation of food and drugs, and the establishment of national parks.
Exactly. The Progressive Era was a really important period in American history. It laid the groundwork for many of the social welfare programs and government regulations that we take for granted today.
So at the beginning of the 20th century, America is an industrial powerhouse, and it's starting to assert itself on the world stage. Then World War I breaks out in Europe. how did that war change America's role in the world?
Well, America initially tried to stay neutral in the war, but it eventually got drawn in, mainly because of German submarine attacks on American ships. And once America entered the war, it really tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. The war also had a huge impact on American society. It led to greater government control of the economy, a wave of patriotism, and unfortunately also a crackdown on dissent and civil liberties.
And after the war, you have this period of economic boom in the 1920s, followed by the devastating crash of the stock market in 1929 and the Great Depression. How did the Depression change America?
The Depression was a national trauma. Millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. It was a time of immense suffering and social unrest, and it really challenged the American belief in individual self-reliance and the free market. People were looking to the government for help, and that led to the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal.
The New Deal really transformed the role of government in American life, didn't it?
It did. It created all sorts of new social programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance. It regulated the banking industry, created jobs through public works projects, and generally tried to provide a safety net for those who were struggling. It was a radical departure from the laissez-faire policies of the past, and it really laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state.
And then, of course, you have World War II, another global conflict that profoundly affected America.
Yeah, World War II was a total war, and it required a total mobilization of American society. Millions of men and women served in the military, and the home front was transformed as factories churned out tanks, planes, and ships. The war also had a huge impact on the American economy. It finally pulled the nation out of the Depression, and it led to a period of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity after the war.
And after the war, you have the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, all sorts of social and political upheavals. It's a lot to take in. But as we look back on this incredibly long and complex history, what do you think are the most important takeaways? What are the really big forces that have shaped America and continue to shape it today?
Well, I think one of the most enduring themes is this ongoing tension between individual liberty and the common good. It's something that Americans have been grappling with since the very beginning. How do you balance the rights of the individual with the needs of society as a whole? It's a question that's at the heart of so many of our political debates, even today.
Right, from mask mandates to gun control.
Exactly. And then you have the related issue of equality. America was founded on this idea that all men are created equal, but the reality has often fallen short of that ideal. We've seen this struggle for equality play out again and again throughout our history, with different groups fighting for their rights: African Americans, women, immigrants, LGBTQ people.
And those struggles are still going on today.
Absolutely. The fight for equality is never truly over. And finally, I think it's important to remember that America has always been a nation of immigrants. That's part of what makes us so unique and dynamic. But it's also a source of tension and conflict. Who gets to be an American? What does it mean to be an American? These are questions that we're still debating today.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered an incredible amount of ground today, but as always, there's so much more to explore. So to our listeners, I would encourage you to keep digging deeper into the history of these social, political, and economic forces that have shaped America. It's a fascinating and endlessly rewarding journey. And who knows, you might even learn something about yourself along the way.
I completely agree. Thanks for having me on the show. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.